When it comes to understanding the complexities of World War II, War of Words, Britain, France, and Discourses of Empire during the Second World War offers a unique and enlightening perspective. In this podcast episode, we're honoured to be joined by
Dr. Rachel Chin. I am a lecturer in war studies at the University of Glasgow.
We'll explore the pivotal roles of Charles de Gaulle and Marshal Pétain, the concept of Discourses of Empire, and the impact of rhetoric on wartime dynamics. How did key figures in critical battles shape Franco-British relations and influence post-war outcomes? Join us for an engaging and thought-provoking conversation that reveals the power of words in the theatre of war and offers valuable lessons on national sovereignty, colonial goals, and alliances. I just want to ask, and this is just my curiosity getting the better of me here, what is your own family history and background, and how does that all relate into then being in Glasgow? Like, as in, I guess what I'm asking is everything before our topic of discussion, I guess, really. Like, who are you? What's your background, and how does that, I guess, also influence your interest in history, if it does?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question actually, because I didn't start when I was in university studying history. I didn't do degrees in history. I did degrees in international studies and in international business at the University of Nebraska. And I only really came to history after my master's degree. I did my master's degree in London in international relations theory and history. And I decided I liked history better. I liked the really specific kind of historical approach it could provide, that I didn't think that the theoretical approaches in international relations, which I found really interesting, but didn't always map onto things in the way they were supposed to. But what I study in history doesn't really match well onto my own kind of family background. I am actually doing some of that now. I mean, for a bit of context, my new research isn't on this topic. It kind of speaks to empire still, but it speaks more to the migration to Chinese migration to the British Caribbean, or to the wider Caribbean as a whole. And that is really part of my family history. The Second World War isn't so much part of my family history. It was just something that captured my interest as a master's student, and the issue of Franco-British relations in particular.
No, okay, thank you for that. That makes a lot more sense in the context. Then just delving into the Franco-British relations and what we're discussing today, particularly in context of the Second World War and their respective empires, is what led you to this being the area that you researched on? As in, I just find it interesting, the journeys that a lot of historians take from going, I don't know, it could be some random thing they've read somewhere and all of a sudden it sparked this huge curiosity, and then something that most people might not even necessarily consider. So how did that come about?
Yeah, I mean, really specifically, actually. I bought a book at the university bookstore. It was a used book. It was John Lukács' book, 5 Days in London, May 1940. And I was really struck by the conversation within the book leading up to the Dunkirk evacuations, where there was this element of tension in the Franco-British relationship, and there was miscommunication. There seemed to be this kind of angst in the relationship, and almost a level of distrust. And it was something that I hadn't encountered before, and I became really interested in that kind of tension and started looking into it more, and started learning about elements of their relationship during the Second World War that I hadn't heard about before, like the British bombardment of the French fleet at Mirs el-Kabir in 1940. All things, I think, that aren't really part of people's casual memory of the Second World War. We reach for things like the Battle of Britain, or the myth of the Blitz, or in the United States, Pearl Harbor. Really kind of things that are imprinted really strongly onto people's kind of cultural or collective memory, and those things aren't. And that made me really interested in wanting to explore them more, and it just kind of became a bigger and bigger project. The last project that I worked on was a big Arts and Humanities Research Council grant that was about the weight of the past in Franco-British relations, and looking at that through a really long time frame from 1815 all the way up to kind of the present day. And so I think it's been a really rich and interesting area of research, but I came to it through, I mean, just picking up a book kind of randomly
That is
at the shop.
amazing. Yeah, yeah. Just then doing your research for this, what were some of the challenges that you encountered and how did you overcome them?
Well, I think two things maybe. Firstly, I was really quite new to history. As I said, I hadn't done a full history degree before. So getting to grips with some of those new kind of processes and thinking about what it meant to be a historian and how to kind of carry out archival research was a challenge. I think that took just time and support and advice from obviously my supervisors. Um, and that was hugely helpful. The second kind of biggest practical issue for me was that I didn't speak French. And I was working on, a project that you really needed to do research in the French archives. And at the time, I could speak and read Spanish. And I joined the PhD project on the understanding that I would learn French as well. And that
Wow.
was challenging. And I was able to pick up the reading kind of relatively quickly to a manageable level because it has similarities with Spanish. But it was intimidating, I think. It was intimidating to go into archives not being fluent in the language and try to negotiate what you want in an
Mm,
archival collection that sometimes isn't organized very well.
wow. That's amazing. And how did that go then, like throughout the process? Like, I'm assuming your French must have got better tremendously quickly because otherwise there's a lot of maneuver for translating things perhaps outside of what they were intended.
Yeah, I think my French is still like it is better. It's good. And I think if there's questions of nuance in terms of word choice, I think it's a question of your French is it good enough to read the archival material, and if there's a finer point of nuance, being able to recognize that and reach out to somebody with more knowledge to ask them about it.
No, fair. No, definitely. Before then, we discussed the pivotal roles of Charles de Gaulle and Marshal Pétain. Could you provide some context then in the state of what Franco-British relations were leading up to World War II? Because, as mentioned previously, like we did World War II at GCSE, at A level, you learn about it throughout secondary school. And up until you mentioned just now, I never actually realized that the context of the competing Allied empires is actually all in the background whilst this is happening. So, what is going on and what is the context leading up to the Second World War?
Well, I think in the Franco-British relationship, maybe 1904 is a kind of pivotal point because that's the point at which the Entente Cordiale, which people talk about so much in terms of, establishing this kind of Franco-British partnership, loosely to speak, is established. So you have that agreement, which is itself very embedded in empire and kind of imperial rivalries. But from that point on, obviously, we know that France and Britain are allies in the First World War. But after the Second World War, whilst you still have the Entente Cordiale in place, this kind of relatively informal agreement, you don't have a formal kind of reciprocal military arrangement in place. And that is, I think, a key point to think about during the period, the interwar period, that time between the First World War and the Second World War. And during this time, France tries a number of times to negotiate an agreement like this with Britain, but it doesn't happen for a variety of reasons. Britain is kind of trying to step back from those kinds of agreements. There's reluctance. There's a lot of political turmoil and instability in France in the interwar years as well, which is challenging for France, but also makes it challenging for it to kind of put together such a relationship. So you have this kind of resistance and you don't have a formal military agreement in the interwar years. But by the time the war breaks out, France and Britain do come together quite quickly and quite closely. The guarantee to Poland is the key kind of juncture at which this happens. So that guarantee is put into place on the 31st of March 1939 and brings Britain and France into the war together in September of 1939. And at that point, you see their relationship really accelerating. You have what's called a Supreme War Council, so that they can coordinate the conduct of the war much better. So the relationship is actually seems quite good at this point, because you have mechanisms that are put into place that encourage this collaboration, that facilitate it, that make it possible. And things like the Supreme War Council that didn't exist until relatively late in the relationship in the First World War, you actually see come together quite early in the Second World War, which I think is an interesting point.
Obviously, then, as the Second World War continues, France is captured or taken over, conquered by the Nazi Germany very, very quickly. And Vichy France is set up as a puppet state. How do the policies and dealings with Nazi Germany, and as a result, what's happening in France, affect Franco-British relations then? Because that's obviously a huge shift within what's happening internally within France.
Yeah, I mean, it has huge ramifications. As you say, the invasion of the Low Countries and of France itself, which is launched on the 10th of May 1940, happens so quickly. And the signing of the Franco-German, and also alongside that, the Franco-Italian armistice in June of 1940, at the end of June, that changes the relationship. But I think what's important to understand is that it doesn't happen right away. There's a gap of time between when Marshal Pétain, who becomes the kind of head of state of the Vichy government, which is in southern France and is unoccupied. He requests armistice terms in the very early morning hours of the 17th of June, 1940. But the terms themselves aren't signed until 5 days later, and they go into effect 3 days after that. And so you have a period of time when actually both Britain isn't sure if France will actually sign an armistice. And there's a lot of uncertainty around that period. So the relationship changes, but I don't think the change happens as quickly as you might expect, because there's a lot of kind of wait and see during this time, whereby policymakers are trying to decide, was the armistice request a ruse? At the same time, you have General Charles de Gaulle, who obviously becomes the leader of the Free French movement. He leaves France and comes over to London. He gives this address over the BBC, which is hugely spoken about now, but actually wasn't preserved at the time, and very few people heard it, on the 18th of June. But the British government is really reluctant to kind of endorse him as a leader of Free France, or what becomes Free France, because they're still waiting to see what will happen. If there'll be, for instance, if the armistice will be declined, if there'll be further resistance from the French colonies, French North Africa in particular. And so the relationship does shift, but there's this moment of uncertainty and pause in the immediate aftermath.
During that kind of that kind of momentary pause that you're discussing, that kind of period where Britain isn't quite sure which way things are going to go, and as you said, politicians are trying to maneuver as best as they can, how do the two competing French governments, I guess, so how do Pétain and de Gaulle try and fight for legitimacy, I guess? Like, how are they trying to ensure they get what they want? And I guess more accurately and in context of our conversation is, how are they trying to, I guess, influence or use the relationship with Britain to their advantage?
For one thing, the Vichy government, and an important piece of context here as well, because historians are obviously at their root, obsessed with the context, is that what becomes the Vichy government is obviously in unoccupied France in the southern zone, in contrast to the northern zone, which is occupied, which includes Paris, of course. And Marshal Pétain is a figure who's hugely respected. He was a hero of the First World War. People like him, and he's an extremely elderly guy even at this point, but people have a lot of respect and trust in him. And so he has a lot of authority as a figure of France. And even the British recognize this. And so when they're trying to kind of delegitimize his government, they're very careful to describe the government as the Bordeaux government, where it was initially, later the Vichy government, where it eventually settles, and not to say necessarily the Pétain government, because they know that people like him and that would be upsetting. So the Vichy government under Pétain, I think their legitimacy is really rooted in two things. Firstly, that they are actually the legal government of France, and that legality is enshrined in their kind of global recognition. The United States recognizes the Vichy government as the legal government of France. And so the recognition of other countries obviously gives them authority. And it's difficult. I don't think you can really argue that they weren't the legal government at the time. So they have that going for them. They also have going for them the fact that they are actually in metropolitan France. So like, the France that we think of. They're actually in France. They're not outside of the boundaries of the French nation. So they have that claim to kind of protection of the body of France or French sovereignty, which they can draw on. With de Gaulle, I think it's a little bit more tricky because obviously he becomes, when the British eventually recognize him as the official leader of the Free French movement, he becomes the figurehead of what is in essence not a legal authority or a legal government, but a kind of external resistance movement. And his authority, I think, is embedded in partially the kind of rhetoric or the way that people talk about what the Free French government is, how they frame it. So he very much frames the movement as the true representative of French interests and in some ways the legal authority. But of course, they're never recognized as a legal government because they're not. The other thing that they eventually have, which is very helpful, is that the seat of Free France is formally placed in French Equatorial Africa, which rallies, and I use that term like slightly lightly, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, comes over to the Free French side in the autumn of 1940. And so they have the authority of having part of the French colonial empire, which is loyal to the Free French government, or, well, it's not a government, but the Free French movement. And I think that's very helpful as well.
That nicely brings me on to the next question, which is how are the French colonies utilized, or how do they become kind of a battleground between the Free French movement, the Vichy government, and Britain? And also then how does it go about affecting the war itself and its aftermath? Because it's interesting to hear that Free French movements kind of places itself in Equatorial Africa, something I was just never even aware of. So it's obvious that the colonies are used to varying degrees. Britain obviously relies heavily on them during the Second World War, but in context of how it's working between the Free French movement, the Vichy government, and Britain, what is going on and what happens during the Second World War?
Yeah, so I mean, your point about Free France being kind of based in French Equatorial Africa and Brazzaville, actually, I mean, Eric Jennings has written a really great book on this topic in particular that's worth a look. But I mean, the empire, I think, has so many different roles in the Second World War. The obvious one, as you say, is this kind of, zone that's important because it's a place where you can draw things that you need to fight a war from. You can draw material, natural resources, things like rubber, diamonds, graphite, lots of other things that you need to actually pursue a war. You also have people that come from the French and the British colonial empires who contribute to the war in lots of different ways. And I think in addition to those things and the kind of strategic importance of empire in terms of a land mass as a potential base for operations, the importance of empire, I think, that comes out, or that I'm speaking about a lot in the book, is the importance of having and holding empire as a resource, as a strategic resource, but also as a symbolic resource. So something that gives you legitimacy as a power. For the Vichy government, being able to hold on to its empire, and linked to that, being able to hold on to its fleet after it had signed the Franco-German armistice, was a really important part of its authority, of its legitimacy, having that empire, being able to keep it. For de Gaulle in the Free French, I think in the same way, having French Equatorial Africa rally to his cause, regardless of how, more nuanced that kind of idea of rallying was also really important because it gave his movement authority. It gave his movement a physical base that was not London. So it was almost like he was still in France. Obviously, of course, in the book, empire is really significant because it's a site of all of these real physical clashes, real battlegrounds where battles are being fought in some ways outside of the way that we usually think about the war. We usually think about the war as being the Axis powers versus the Allied powers, and it's really black and white. But when you bring empire into the picture, it becomes so much more complicated because you have instances of combined British, Free French, and British imperial forces fighting against forces that are loyal to an alternative representative of French interests, the Vichy government. And they're obviously real battles with real consequences and real fatalities. So they have a huge importance. But I also think they have that other underlying importance of how they impact this other relationship, the kind of triangular British, Vichy, Free French relationship, which is part of the war also, but flies under the radar in that black and white Allied versus Axis powers dynamic. I think after the war, I think the issue of anti-imperial nationalism and how it plays a part within the war itself, within these clashes, is a factor to think about. And after the war, I think empire just becomes a really important asset for both France and Britain in terms of shoring up its post-war legitimacy and authority. But it has to kind of maintain that asset while also recognizing that they're kind of diminished powers in terms of, what they can actually do with the money and resources that they have left.
Your discussion referring to the actual physical battles that took place also very nicely brings me on to the next question, which is how do some of those critical battles like Dakar, Syria, Lebanon become turning points for Franco-British relations and the broader war effort? How do some of those influential or critical battles influence relations between Britain and the various forms of French government or movements, or there's not, I guess, quite a word that captures both of them? And then also, how does it affect the war effort post these kind of turning points?
So I think in the case of Dakar, which takes place in September of 1940, so relatively shortly after the signing of the Franco-German armistice, What this battle, I suppose, I mean, what happens is that a kind of British force sails to Dakar, and there alongside them are some of Charles de Gaulle's kind of Free French forces as well. And they have the feeling that maybe they can get Dakar to rally to the Free French as well. As it happens, the forces at Dakar refuse to do this and there's an exchange of fire in the port at Dakar, and the British eventually and the Free French eventually withdraw. But I think what this particular event really illustrates and really drives home for the British, but also for de Gaulle and the Free French, is that the individuals who have chosen to remain loyal to the Vichy government, which is a substantial number of colonial officials and government officials, are loyal, and that they're willing to put, firepower behind that loyalty, and that it's not going to be this really easy kind of, oh, come over to the Allied side now. We know we're here. You can relax your defenses and just rejoin the Allies. So I think it's a real kind of marker of, how much more difficult it's going to be in terms of potentially convincing people to come over to that side. In terms of the other two, related instances in Syria and Lebanon, that similarly, I think, just echoes and kind of builds upon what happens at Dakar. What you see there is a really protracted battle that takes place between an invading force of Free French, British, and a substantial contingent of French colonial or Commonwealth soldiers who are battling forces that are very loyal to the Vichy French in the French Levant states in the Middle East, which are Syria and Lebanon. And I think it again kind of drives home that real, physical divide that exists within the war. And it's hugely substantial in that case. I think it also speaks to the wider strategic significance of empire as a whole in the prosecution of the war, that imperial territories played really important strategic roles in the actual fighting and prosecution of the war, and that when those battles took place, that they just weren't always between the two sides that you would expect.
Just out of curiosity, considering, as you've mentioned, there's conflict, like physical firepower conflict going on between Vichy France on one hand and Free French movement in some description on the other hand, with support or working alongside, say, the British. How do relations, like I know our main topic is French and British relations, but how do relations actually between Vichy France and the Free French movement evolve during the Second World War?
I don't think they really do, to be honest. I think essentially there isn't a relationship, because for the Vichy government, you can't have a debate about whether Free France is legitimate or not. So the dynamic is important, because for the Vichy government, when these kind of battles are happening, it's always about the British and about, the ex-General de Gaulle and his so-called Free French movement, that kind of like writing off of the authority or legitimacy of a group. And instead the focus of the kind of the rancor of the French government, of the Vichy government, is kind of positioned on this idea of Franco-British rivalry. It's about like Britain being, the perfidious Albion that it's always been in the past. Britain is always trying to take the French Empire. Look at all these things it did in the 19th century and in the 20th century, and that it's doing now and that it will continue to do tomorrow. So I think in that sense, the dynamic is focused for Vichy on the Franco-British relationship, and they've got to kind of ignore the Free French. Otherwise, that puts them in an awkward position.
That makes a lot of sense. I just then wanted to ask you, obviously there's Vichy France and there's the Free French movement, and then obviously thousands and thousands of French citizens that are living under this new regime, how does their public opinion of what's happening influence or shape the strategies of the different kind of like, so I guess what I'm trying to get at is how does the public opinion influence, say, Vichy France, the Free French movement, and even the British in terms of what they do and how they go about doing that?
I think that this is a really tricky question, partially because it's really difficult to pin down what public opinion is. And I think we can agree on the idea that there is no one single or unitary public opinion, and that obviously public opinion as it exists is changing all the time. It's not a static thing. That being said, in the book, the way that I deal with this or try to define it is by looking at how policymakers view public opinion. Because what really matters in terms of trying to decide if policymakers or decision makers are impacted by public opinion, it doesn't matter what public opinion actually is. It just matters what they think it is. And what you see, for instance, in the British case is that public opinion was tracked through the press a lot. So there was a huge focus on the press in terms of what the press were reporting and thinking about that as representing public opinion. There were some kind of early measures of public opinion. Things like Gallup were relatively new, but there was another project called the Mass Observation Project. And that, I think, was something that the government also considered to a certain extent. But I think what is interesting about public opinion is that policymakers think it matters, and as a result of that, they spend an awful lot of time crafting different policy statements that people are going to read. They spend a lot of time putting together different kind of propaganda materials, different messages to the French population as well. And I mean, what do these messages actually look like? So in the British case, when they're trying to, they always represent the French population as being fundamentally opposed to the Vichy government. I don't think that necessarily maps onto the reality. The Vichy government, or Pétain in particular, was quite popular throughout his kind of tenure. But that didn't mean that people were kind of collaborationist. They were largely in support of the Allied war effort. But British propaganda or British messaging around the French population always depicted them as being ultimately kind of loyal to the Allies and ultimately loyal to the war effort and disloyal to the Pétain government. Where I think public opinion comes in occasionally, and in the book where it comes to the fore, I think there's two maybe occasions. Firstly, in the 1942 operations, the Torch operations, which were the American-led invasions of French North Africa. Those operations were planned on the belief that the opinion, both the public opinion, but also the opinion of people who'd potentially be fighting against such an invasion, would respond better to that invasion if it were led by American forces. Because if it was a British-led invasion, it would bring forth, this was the thinking, more resistance because of this kind of issue of Franco-British rivalry and things, the kind of battles that had come before that. That was the thinking. The reality, I mean, it's difficult to determine if that was actually effective or not. But all of the kind of planning and the propaganda materials around that event were crafted on the basis of that belief. There were massive booklets, for instance, that were distributed all over France by airplane that are all these images of the kind of previous American and French cooperation, in particular during the First World War. So things like, oh, don't worry, the Americans are coming to rescue you again, as we did before. We're very friendly, that kind of thing. And it's just really interesting. So regardless, I think, of whether public opinion is accurately measured, the reality is that all of these kind of policy decisions and thinking around them, policymakers do spend a fair amount of time and energy kind of trying to respond to the idea of public opinion or craft materials speaking to public opinion, and that matters.
I love that bit that you said that they're dropping pamphlets that are saying basically we're not British and we're on our way to save you. I think that summarizes kind of where Franco-British relations are during the war, quite, or at least how people making those policies perceive it. Because yeah, that's a hilarious and yet very kind of brilliant little example of that. As the Second World War goes on, and obviously as it nears its end, the Allies are victorious. How does everything towards, I guess, the end of the war evolve between Vichy France, British, and the Free French movement? And then how do these groups affect post-war colonial and international restructuring? From my assumption, I would assume Vichy France has absolutely nothing to do with it, considering the power dynamics with when the Allies win. But I'm not the expert, and hence why I'm asking you the question. So yeah, what is going on towards the end of the war, and how are things restructured post that between these two kind of powers and the others, I guess?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, after the Torch invasions of French North Africa in November of 1942, at that point the German government actually occupies the rest of France. So no part of France is from this point onward unoccupied. The Vichy government kind of stays in place in a certain way. Pétain's role changes. He becomes very much more of a figurehead, and doesn't have a great deal of authority. But from this moment on, I mean, if the Vichy regime was what you describe at the beginning as a kind of puppet regime, it really is just, a shell at this point. So by the end of the war, what happens is that in France, you have the arrest and prosecution of a huge number of Vichy officials, including Pétain and including figures like Pierre Laval, who was seen as this kind of arch ideological collaborator with the Nazi regime. So you're right, they don't have a whole lot to do. There are certain levels of continuity between the Vichy government, figures that were in the Vichy government and figures in the post-war period. And this is something that Philip Nord talks about in his book. And that's a reality. But after this, in 1944, you have the creation of a kind of French provisional government, which is headed by Charles de Gaulle. And this is the government that is really starting to do the negotiation around what France will look like in the post-war period, but also what will happen to its empire in the post-war period. So these negotiations and discussions are happening at the same time. And I think they're really, closely, bound up with each other. Because for France, or the provisional government, but also for the British government, empire at this point, I think becomes a really important, I called it an asset earlier, but it becomes important to keep it, even if in a slightly different state than it was in before the war, whereby maybe you've relinquished some of your control over these territories, you've granted some concessions in response to the contributions during the war that imperial territories provided. But empire is seen, I think, really as something that is important to keep hold of, because in the aftermath of such a devastating war, it's symbolic of your continued greatness as a power, as a kind of great power, because great powers need empire. And so there is a real commitment to sustaining empire, even if there's also a commitment to renegotiating it slightly so that they can keep hold of them in the reality of the post-war world, whereby obviously you don't have that kind of same power as you did before. And so both France and Britain are trying to renegotiate that. Around all of that, you have what is seen as the potential maybe threat to the future of empire, which is mostly a kind of American, but to a lesser extent Soviet, history of anti-imperial rhetoric. And there is some worries, I think, that America will support the dismantling of these empires. I think there's a scholar called Martin Shipway who described American anti-imperial policy as more rhetorical than actual, and I think that's a kind of good way of thinking about it. But as a result of that, Britain, for instance, puts together this short booklet, and I can't remember exactly what its name is. I think it's maybe The Future of the Colonial Peoples or something like that. But it's printed and it's distributed in America, and in the discussions around it, it's really put together as a piece to kind of build American support for the British Empire, to demonstrate that the empire is different and acceptable. And in the discussions, British policymakers are saying things like, well, let's put this together. Let's do this because American officials tend to be kind of blithe and they don't understand the empire and its benefits. But if we include these statistics and these charts, it will be excellent because American people love statistics and charts and they'll be totally won over. So there's this real effort after the war, I think, to shore up empire in these various different ways.
That's crazy. I'm going to try and find that little booklet if I can online somewhere.
I have one. I bought it, I think, on Amazon.
Oh, nice. It sounds super interesting. Just out of my curiosity, has got the better of me with this. Just then kind of looking at your book, like overall, like some of the themes that you touch upon are language, power, identity. You talk about kind of national sovereignty, obviously alliances on and influences on historical outcomes. Like just taking what we can learn from your book, how do you think it maps onto, say, the more current global political landscape, or kind of what can we learn from that we can apply today?
Well, I think at the core of my book, and obviously the word discourse is in the title, but at the core of the book, what I really want to emphasize is that words really matter. Because that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about rhetoric and discourse. I'm talking about words coming together as persuasive language. And I think in that is the real message of the book, and that provides a link to more contemporary, I think, challenges, but also opportunities. Because obviously that adage, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And really, what the book is saying and insisting on is that words are really powerful, and that these constructs of kind of the way that we speak about things, whether they be contemporary events or the way that we interpret the past, of course, they're words, but what they do is construct really powerful, really durable ways of thinking. And in doing that, they can influence not just how we think, but also what we do. So they influence actions as well. And they represent, they construct really durable ways of thinking about our place in the world. And I think that's what we can transfer to more kind of contemporary constructs, to really think carefully about how that power that words can have.
That is a brilliant answer. And it's left me with a lot to ponder. But with I just want to ask the last question, which is, are there any areas of this historical period that you think warrant further exploration?
I think with the Second World War as a whole, even though some may argue that there is too much research on it, I think there's always something else to say. I think it's a topic that still has a great deal of contemporary relevance.
Yeah.
One thing that I'd like to do, that I hope to do in the near future actually, is explore the the persistence of the idea of the Dunkirk spirit, and how I've done a really brief mapping exercise using the British Parliamentary Archives, Hansard, to see how many times Dunkirk spirit has been mentioned in different parliamentary debates since 1940. And it's a huge number. And I'd like to really do a close look and map that out and see the contexts in which it was used, and to map it over time, and to kind of just bring that out, which is quite a small thing. But I think for the war as a whole, I think from the imperial context, I'd like to see a little bit more work being done about we speak a lot about kind of imperial, well, not a lot, but more than we did before, about the role of imperial subjects who took part in the war effort, whether that was in battlefields or, for instance, working within the Britain itself. But I'd like to do a bit more about the experiences of the kind of ethnic minority communities that lived or in the British Empire, the French Empire at the time, and their experiences in war. I'm doing a bit of this in relation to my explorations of Chinese migration to Jamaica, and have uncovered some really interesting stuff about, the experiences of that community within Jamaica during the war, which is incredibly interesting because there was a lot of support within the community for the Chinese war effort in particular. And I think those stories often fly under the radar again, or kind of hidden from history, and deserve a bit of light shed on them.
No, definitely. I will keep an eye out for when that research comes out, and I'd love to look forward to reading it, because that sounds really, really interesting. Just from the little that you've mentioned. I just want to double check. I got to the end of the questions that I had prepared. Is there anything that you think we haven't covered, or anything that you wish to include?
I don't think so. I guess maybe one thing that's maybe worth mentioning is the Franco-British relationship in terms of the British Free French relationship. I think that is a relationship in the book that I think it's really clear that it's a really tricky one at times, because you have this tension with de Gaulle, who's at the head of a movement which is purporting to be, in essence, a kind of French government in exile in some ways, which is obviously not. But his movement is supported financially by the British, and so he's kind of, his actions are limited in that way. And that makes the relationship very, very, perhaps, volatile at times, under the surface in particular, because you have a tension between the two parties, one who has kind of financial control, but the other who's the face of French interests. And so in that sense, you have a kind of underlying tension, but on the surface, both parties need to keep that relationship really calm and positive. And that just does generally happen throughout the war, despite kind of underlying tensions. Not always, but most of the time. And I think that's maybe a thread that's lost from people's memories of the Franco-British relationship during the war. It's very easy to reach to the idea of Franco-British tension in the relationship, because it's something that is part of the post-war narrative. But actually, the real kind of importance of that relationship, of the British Free French relationship, was that it represented a continuity in Franco-British alliance, in Franco-British collaboration during the war. And so in that sense, it really drives home the idea of the Second World War as a shared experience, rather than a strictly national one, which is the way that it's remembered a lot of the time.
My last question, I promise, is what happens to Marshal Pétain in the end then? So Charles de Gaulle, as you said, post-Reconstruction, he's quite pivotal, but what happens with Pétain?
So Pétain is put on trial, and he is imprisoned for a time, but he is not executed.
Wow. And he's not executed because of the amount
other
of public support he has?
I think partially. I think he's, at this point, quite elderly. I think he's
Really?
in his mid to late 80s. I can't remember for some reason, I
Wow.
think he was maybe 81 when he came to power in 1940, but I'd have to double check that. But others, like Pierre Laval, for instance, are executed. If my memory serves me right, Pierre Laval actually basically tries to commit suicide before his execution, and he's unsuccessful. The Allies revive him, and then they execute him.
Oh, wow.
So there's a yeah, a period in France after the liberation, which people refer to as the purges, which involved a huge number of trials. The kind of appetite for it actually dies out relatively quickly. A lot of people who are initially sentenced to death have their sentences commuted. A lot of people are sentenced to like life in prison or are later released, but there are a huge number of trials, and there's also a lot of, on a local level, there's a lot of kind of what's called like punishments for horizontal collaboration. So the punishment of
Yeah.
women who
Yeah.
slept with German
And they shave
occupiers.
their heads and stuff, don't they? Yeah.
Yeah, so that, but I can't remember exactly how long Pétain was in prison for, um, and all of the details around his trial. I'd have to double check. But Julian Jackson's book France the Dark Years is very good for that.
I will have to check it out because it sounds like things get really, really interesting post the end of the Second World War in France with all these purges and stuff. So yeah, it would be interesting to see what's going on there. But no, I just wanted to say thank you for your time. We've spent almost an hour with all those questions, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I've learned a hell of a lot, and I hope everyone listening to it also learns a lot. And yeah, I just thank you for everything.
Thanks very much for having me. It's been lovely.
No, not a problem. Thank you.